The Pruitt lawyer left me alone in my apartment with a signed covenant on the table and a question I couldn't stop turning over. What exactly had Margaret witnessed in that house that broke her mind so completely she spent the last decade of her life convinced something had followed her out? I sat with the covenant for a long time after Cale left. Not reading it, I had read it enough times to recite the operative clauses from memory, but sitting with it the way you sit with something you haven't decided about yet, as though proximity might eventually translate to understanding. The apartment felt different with him gone, which I hadn't expected. His presence had been so controlled, so still, that I'd assumed his absence would feel like relief. Instead, the room felt suspended, like a held breath. The document lay at the exact angle he had left it. I hadn't touched it. I wasn't sure I wanted to find out what it felt like under my hands again, the weight of it, the way paper that old seems to have absorbed something from every pair of hands that pressed against it before yours. Margaret's name kept surfacing in every recess of the thing I was doing, which I was calling research, and which was actually something closer to dread with a methodology. I found her in the county archive digitization, a probate filing from 31 years ago, her name attached to the same estate designation that had eventually come to me. She had petitioned for possession. The petition was granted. And then, 14 days later, there was a second filing, a voluntary withdrawal of claim, a single handwritten line at the bottom of the instrument that read, "I relinquish all interest in and obligation to the Pruitt property." The handwriting was uneven. It did not look like the signature at the top of the document. It looked like someone who had come back from somewhere and had not entirely arrived. I drove out on a Tuesday, in the early morning when the light was still low and the fog sat in the fields like it owned them. I told myself the reason I was going was practical. I needed to see the property before I made any decision about the covenant, and that was true. But the real reason, the one I didn't say aloud even to myself until I was already an hour out of the city, was Margaret. I needed to understand what she had seen that was bad enough to make her undo her own legal claim in 14 days. What had happened in that house between the filing and the withdrawal that turned careful handwriting into something that barely held its shape? I had her photograph in my bag, the one Harlan Deeds had given me, black and white, the woman standing in front of the farmhouse door with an expression I couldn't name. Not fear, something past fear, something that had settled into the bones and stopped moving. The farmhouse looked exactly the same. That was the first thing that unsettled me about it. Not the isolation, not the silence, not the particular quality of the light that seemed to come from the wrong angle for the time of morning. It looked cared for. The paint on the porch was not peeling. The window frames were solid. A building empty for years should show neglect in small ways. A gutter pulling free, a shutter hung wrong, a door that doesn't quite sit flush in its frame. This one didn't. Every surface read as maintained, and that maintenance had no logical source. I had sold the property, the sale had been vacated, and no one had been authorized to tend to anything. I stood in the drive and looked at the front of the house and thought about what kind of upkeep doesn't leave footprints. The key Harlan Deeds had given me at closing still worked. I had half expected it not to, had half expected some Pruitt lock, some mechanism I didn't have the right instrument for. The door opened cleanly. The smell was the first thing, not rot, not dust, not the particular dead air quality of a sealed room. Cedar and something faintly mineral, like a well-cleaned stone floor. The kind of smell that means someone has been here recently and has cleaned before leaving. I stepped into the front room and the floor did not creak. I stood very still for a moment, listening to the silence, which was the loudest kind. Not the silence of an empty space, but the silence of a space where the ambient sound has been deliberately removed, like a recording with the room tone stripped out. I did not know what that meant. I noted it. I moved through the ground floor methodically, the way you do when you are trying to stay calm by giving yourself tasks. Kitchen. Clean. A dish towel folded over the oven handle, a single cup upside down on the drying rack. Dining room. A table set for no one, 2 chairs pushed in, one pulled out a few inches as if someone had just risen. The study. bookshelves with a gap on the middle shelf, the books on either side standing upright, as though the missing volume had been removed carefully and the neighbors had leaned in to fill the space. Every room told the same story. Someone had been using this house and had stopped recently, cleanly, leaving no mess, but also leaving no fiction of abandonment. The house had not been vacant. It had been occupied up until very recently, and the question of who had been living here while the property moved through probate was one I hadn't thought to ask before now. The basement door was at the back of the kitchen, behind a pantry shelf that had been built to look like a wall. I found it because the shelf was off, not dramatically, not with a hinge showing or a gap in the plaster, but the proportions were wrong. The space behind the shelves was 6 inches deeper than the exterior measurement of the house suggested it should be. I had measured the outside from the driveway out of habit, the way you do when you've spent too long reading about old buildings with false walls and priest holes and rooms that aren't on any floor plan. The shelf moved when I pressed the right corner, which told me it had been moved before, many times, by someone who knew exactly where the mechanism was. Behind it, a door, plain wood, no lock. A string-pull light switch, concrete stairs going down into the kind of dark that doesn't look like it ends. I pulled the string. A single bare bulb lit the stairs and the top half of the room below. The first thing I saw was shelving, floor to ceiling, built in, the same careful workmanship as the rest of the house. The second thing I saw was that every shelf was full. Not storage, not household overflow, not the accumulated clutter of decades. Uniform black binders, labeled in a consistent hand, dated. I could read the nearest spines from the top of the stairs. 1989, 1990, 1991. A row of them. Then a row above. 1978, 1979, 1980. The full width of the room, organized by year, going back far enough that the bottom rows were beyond the light's reach. I stood at the top of the stairs for a long time before I went down, not because I was afraid, exactly. Fear had given way by then to something that felt more like vertigo, the feeling of looking down from a height you hadn't realized you'd climbed. The 1989 binder was the one I opened first because it was nearest. Inside, ledger pages, printed forms, handwritten notes in the margins. The ledger tracked, in columns, dates, times, and a category labeled simply occurrence, with entries ranging from a single word to a full paragraph. February 14, 1989. Occurrence. Sound, lower level, 2:10 a.m. to 2:44 a.m. Duration, 34 minutes. No physical evidence. Resident present and documented. March 3, 1989. Occurrence. Visual, hallway between study and kitchen. Duration, approx. 8 seconds. Resident present. Notation, consistent with prior March presentations. There were photographs behind the ledger pages, Polaroids, clipped in, each labeled with a date and a location within the house. I looked at the first one for a long time before I understood what I was looking at. It showed the basement room I was standing in, it showed the shelves I was looking at, and it showed the shelf I had just pulled the binder from. Except in the photograph, the shelf was full, and on the shelf where the 1989 binder should have been, there was instead a notation written in grease pencil directly on the shelf edge, pending. I understood then the structure of what I was looking at. This was not a haunting log. The word that kept surfacing as I moved along the shelves, pulling binders, scanning pages, was the word Cale had used, and I had not been able to parse. Witness. The covenant's obligation of witness was not metaphor, not spiritual language, not a 19th century formulation for residency. It was a literal operational protocol. The resident was required to be present during occurrences, to document their duration, their location, their character, to record what happened, and to record that a living person had observed it. The binders were the record, the photographs were the evidence. The women who had lived in this house had not been haunted. They had been employed. They had been hired, generation after generation, to sit inside a cage and take notes on what the cage was holding. I carried a stack of binders to the stairs and sat down on the fourth step and began to read in chronological order, starting from the oldest volume I could reach without moving deeper into the room. 1961. That year's record was in two different hands, a transition mid-year, a brief notation that read, primary resident deceased, secondary resident assuming documentation, and then a new handwriting picking up in July without ceremony. No grief in the notation. No shock. A clean professional transfer, as if shift managers had rotated and the work continued. The occurrences from that year were recorded with the same flat precision as everything else: dates, times, durations, room locations, and in the margin of one November entry, in a hand that I identified as the secondary residence, a single sentence that had been underlined twice. It does not appear when the documentation lapses. I read that line 4 times. The implication was not subtle. The recording was not incidental. The recording was functional. The witness was not observing something contained. The witness was part of the containment. Margaret's binder was labeled with her name rather than a year, the only one like that on any shelf I could find. It sat in a section between 1991 and 1993, a gap where 2 years' worth of documentation should have been, and her name was written in someone else's handwriting, not hers. I opened it knowing something about what I was going to find, and I was still not prepared for it. The first pages were in the same format as every other binder: dates, times, occurrences cataloged in the flat procedural language the protocol required. But somewhere around the 3rd week of her documented residency, something changed. The handwriting became denser. The margins filled. The category notation, occurrence, began to be replaced by longer descriptions that spilled past the margin lines and continued on the backs of pages. Whatever Margaret had seen, whatever the house had shown her in those 3rd and 4th weeks, she had not been able to contain it in the column. Margaret's last entry was not dated. It was 2 sentences, written in large, uneven letters that pressed hard enough to corrugate the page. I have seen what it looks like when it knows it is not being recorded. I will not write that down. That was it. Below it, in the other handwriting, the one that had labeled the binder, a notation: resident voluntarily withdrew claim. Documentation gap, 1991 to 1993 results, are classified under contingency protocol, and below that, a single line I had to read twice to believe: gap period occurrences continued without resident witness, consequences assessed and contained. I sat on the basement stairs with that binder and tried to understand what it meant for something to continue without a witness, and what it meant for those consequences to have been assessed and contained, and by whom, and at what cost. I put Margaret's binder down and sat in the silence of the basement for a long time. The bare bulb hummed, a low, barely audible electrical tone that I had not noticed when I first came down. I noticed it now. It was the only sound in the room. I thought about the word containment. I had been using it as a metaphor since I came down the stairs, the house as a cage, the witness as a jailer, but sitting in that room with 30 years of documentation on every wall, I understood that I had been using it incorrectly. A cage contains something from the inside. Containment, in the sense these binders described, was more specific. The occurrences did not stop when there was no witness. They continued. What the presence of a witness appeared to do was keep them bounded, keep them located, keep them inside whatever perimeter the house represented. The witness was not observing something trapped. The witness was the trap. I did not go deeper into the room. There was a section of shelving in the far corner that the bare bulb didn't reach, and I had been aware of it since I came down, in the way you are aware of something you are not looking at directly. I am not sure what stopped me from crossing the room to examine it. I told myself it was pragmatic. I had what I needed to understand the structure of the thing, and additional documentation would not change the operative fact that I now understood. But the honest accounting is that at some point in those 2 hours in the basement, the quality of the silence in the far corner had changed. Not a sound, not a movement. A change in the quality, the texture. The silence in that section of the room was attentive in a way that the rest of the room was not. I had documented it in my head, the way the protocol would have required, and I did not cross the room, and I went back up the stairs. I was back in the kitchen before I let myself think about what I had actually done by going down there. The covenant required a witness. I had been in the basement for at least 2 hours, in the presence of whatever the documentation described. I had observed. I had, without signing a single line, performed the central obligation of a document I had explicitly refused. And the question that followed from that was one I turned over and over as I stood at the kitchen counter with my hands flat on the tile. Was the witness role activated by the signing or by the act? Cale had never specified. The covenant's language was about obligation, about recording, about remaining present. I had done all three. I had come here, I had stayed, and I had witnessed. The question of whether that constituted acceptance under the terms of a document I hadn't touched since I left my apartment was not a question I could answer, and I had a feeling it was not a question any lawyer I could afford would be able to answer either. I was at the front door, coat on, bag over my shoulder, when I went back for the 1989 binder. I told myself it was evidence, that I needed to have something to show an attorney, that a physical record of the protocol would support whatever legal challenge I might build. That was true, and it was also beside the point. The real reason was that the binder felt safer in my hands than on that shelf, which was not a rational thing to feel about a record book, and which I felt anyway with a certainty I could not argue with. I tucked it under my arm. I did not take Margaret's binder. I could not explain why, not fully, not in a way that maps onto logic, except that Margaret's binder felt like it belonged in that room, felt like removing it would constitute a different kind of violation than removing an annual log. I closed the pantry shelf behind me. I heard the latch click. I went out the front door and did not look back at the house, and got into the car and sat there for a while without starting it. I drove back toward the city with the binder on the passenger seat. I did not open it. I watched it in my peripheral vision the way you watch something you are not sure is stationary, not because I expected it to move, but because having it in the car had changed the quality of the air in the car, the way a living thing changes the air in a room it occupies. I know how that sounds. I am reporting it accurately. I stopped at a gas station 40 minutes from the farmhouse because I needed to think, and the act of driving required more continuous surface attention than I could spare. I bought coffee I didn't drink, and stood in the parking lot in the gray morning light and tried to construct a coherent position on what I knew. What I knew was this: the house held something. The covenant was designed to hold it there. The mechanism of holding was human witness, generation after generation, and the money was not payment for suffering. It was incentive to remain proximate to something no one would stay near for free. I thought about the women. Clara, who signed in 1887 and spent her life in that house and, according to what the ledgers suggested, kept the documentation with the same flat professional precision as every record I had read. Whatever she had seen, she had encoded it in the required format and continued. Her daughters, who had inherited not just the obligation, but the methodology, the protocol already established, the shelves already partly filled, the expectation of occurrence already normalized. Edna, whose handwriting I had recognized in the middle section of the archive, the same handwriting from the photograph inscription, small and careful and, in the margin notes, occasionally angry, not at the house, not at the occurrences, but at the Pruitt family's update to the documentation forms, which she had annotated with the word unnecessary in 3 separate places. She had been annoyed. She had lived her entire adult life in a house she could not leave, witnessing things she could not name, and her emotional residue in the archive was irritation at a bureaucratic revision. I did not know whether that was extraordinary resilience or the most complete horror I had encountered yet. My phone rang when I was 20 minutes from the city. Cale. I looked at the name on the screen for long enough that it went to voicemail, and then I looked at the road and thought about what a person who knew I had been to the house would say when I called back. I pulled over. I listened to the voicemail. His voice was the same as it had been in my apartment, unhurried, precise, the specific register of someone conveying information they consider important and self-evident. He said that he was aware I had visited the property. He said that my visit had been noted in the protocol. He said that he would appreciate a call at my convenience, and that there was an additional element of the covenant's terms he had not yet had the opportunity to share, which he believed I would now be in a position to understand. He did not say what it was. He did not need to. The structure of the sentence was its own content. There was something he had held back deliberately, something he had been waiting for me to see the basement before he told me. I called him back from the parking lot of my building because I needed to be in motion, needed the walk from the car to the elevator to have something to do with my hands and my body while I listened to whatever he was going to tell me. He answered immediately. He thanked me for returning the call with a courtesy that felt genuinely procedural rather than social. And then he told me to look at the binder I had taken from the basement. Not the ledger pages, not the Polaroids, but the inside back cover. I held the phone against my shoulder and opened the binder with both hands on the concrete floor of the parking structure. Inside the back cover, affixed with the same careful archival tape as everything else in the documentation, was a sheet of paper. Not a ledger page, not a photograph. A list of names, 22 names, in chronological order, with dates beside each one, dates that I recognized as the years each generation had taken possession of the property. My great-great-grandmother Clara at the top. My grandmother. My mother, who had died when I was 9 and who had never mentioned the farmhouse in my hearing. And at the bottom, below a line that read, "Current generation designate." My name, with a date beside it. 3 weeks before Cale Pruitt rang my apartment buzzer for the first time. Cale said, and his voice did not change in any way I could measure, that the designation was not something the Pruitt family had decided. The list was not generated by their office. The first record of the list existed in a document predating the Pruitt family's involvement with the property by approximately 40 years, in a handwriting that matched nothing in the known archive. My name, in an instrument that predated my birth by generations, in a handwriting that predated the Pruitts themselves. He let the silence after that statement do what it needed to do, and then he said that the covenant was not an agreement the Pruitt family had designed to serve their interests. They had inherited it the same way I had. They had found the list, found the obligation, and taken up the work of facilitating the transitions, because the alternative, a generation that did not know, that went to the property unprepared, had happened once, in 1932, and the record of that year was the only binder in the archive that was stored separately, in a locked cabinet I had not found. He said I should not try to find it. I stood in that parking structure for a long time after the call ended. The binder was open in my hands, and I was looking at my name and the date beside it, and thinking about what it means to be selected for something before you exist. The Pruitt family had not chosen me. Whatever had written that list had not consulted anyone. I had inherited a house I had not known about, sold it in a transaction that was voided before it cleared, and refused a covenant I did not understand, and every one of those decisions had been anticipated. The refusal, the drive back to the farmhouse, the 2 hours in the basement, the list had a date beside my name that preceded all of it, and the date had not been wrong. At some point, the cold of the concrete structure became something I could not ignore, and I closed the binder and went inside, and I sat at my kitchen table with the binder in front of me, and I thought about my mother, who had died when I was 9 and had never mentioned a farmhouse, and wondered what she had known and when she had known it, and what it had cost her to keep it from me. The money, Cale had said in those final minutes of the call, was not payment. It was incentive architecture. The Pruitt family's phrase for it in the operational documents was consideration, in the old legal sense, something given to make a contract binding. But the deeper function was simpler. It was the reason a person would say yes to a thing they might otherwise refuse. Every generation had been offered an amount that was meaningful enough to matter, not obscene, not the kind of sum that raises questions, but the specific number that a person in a specific kind of financial difficulty would accept without the second calculation. The Pruitt family had been running the intake process for over a century, and they had become very good at knowing what a person's yes would cost. My number had been calibrated too. The sale price that had felt like luck, the 17 bidders, the wire that hit my account before the questions had fully formed, all of it had been the consideration, shaped to fit the contours of my particular financial terror. I had been selected and priced before I had ever heard the word covenant. There was one more thing Cale told me before he ended the call, and it was the thing I had not been able to stop returning to since. He said that my visit to the property had been noted in the protocol. He had said this at the beginning of the voicemail, and I had set it aside in favor of what followed. But the meaning of it was specific in a way I now understood. Noted in the protocol meant recorded. It meant that my 2 hours in the basement constituted a documented occurrence period, that I had been present and observing during that window, and that in the operational architecture of the covenant, the distinction between a signed witness and an unsigned one who had nonetheless witnessed was a question the 1887 instrument addressed directly. He told me to read Clause 7. I had not read Clause 7. The covenant was still on my kitchen table where I had left it. I crossed the apartment and picked it up and found Clause 7, which was 3 sentences long, and which established that any party who entered the property in knowledge of the covenant's terms and remained present during a period of occurrence was bound by the witness obligation regardless of the formal execution of the instrument. I had known about the covenant before I drove out there. I had stayed. I had witnessed. Clause 7 did not care about my signature. I put the covenant back on the table and sat with it the same way I had the night Cale left it there. The apartment was very quiet. Outside, the city moved. Traffic, someone's music 2 floors above, the ordinary texture of a building full of people living at 11 p.m. Inside, the quality of the quiet was the same quality I had registered in the farmhouse's front room. Not the silence of an empty space, but the silence of a space where the ambient sound has been deliberately reduced. I noticed that. I noted it, the way the protocol would have required. I did not write it down. But I noticed it, and noticing felt like an action, felt like something that had a direction and a consequence, and I sat in my kitchen in the city with the covenant in front of me and my name on a list that predated my birth, and thought about the thing Margaret had written in large, uneven letters on the last page of her binder. I have seen what it looks like when it knows it is not being recorded. She had refused to write down what that looked like. She had removed herself from the property and spent the rest of her life certain something had followed her home. I was sitting in my kitchen in the city, and I had not signed anything, and I had witnessed for 2 hours, and the room was very quiet in a way it had not been quiet before I went to the farmhouse. I noted that too. Margaret refused to write down what she saw when it knew it wasn't being recorded, and she never recovered. What would you have done? Signed the covenant, or walked away?